Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the best Beethoven Symphony number 4. And this is an extremely exciting talk for me because I adore the Symphony number 4. I like it a lot better than Symphony number 3, which some of you may find heretical because the Eroica, that's the third, in case you were wondering, is one of the biggest, most celebrated, enormous, iconic Beethoven pieces. And of course, the one on the other side, the fifth, is, well, it's the fifth, right? So what do you do about the fourth? Well, in my view, you simply listen to it and enjoy it for the totally sublime and masterful piece of music that it is. I really, really think it is the most misunderstood of all of Beethoven's symphonies. And the reason is really very simple. It's because it's happy. No one knows what to make of music that's happy. I mean, sad music is easy. I personally think sad is kind of cheap. It's very easy to be sad. It's very easy to be tragic. You just grab a minor key and hang on to it until people get miserable. And then you're in business and everybody praises you for being deep and profound and spiritual and sublime and all of that stuff. But nobody gets happiness. And not only is the fourth happy, it's not just one kind of happy. It's not just happy. It's happy in all of its manifestations, in all of its shades and nuances. It's an extraordinary, extraordinary experience. And in terms of pure compositional technique, it is about a zillion light years ahead of the Eroica. It really, really is. I mean, and I'm going to talk about those things a little bit because I really think it's about time someone gave the fourth some credit. Even in Beethoven's day, nobody knew what to make of it. And Beethoven's eighth is in a similar position because it was paired with the seventh, which is great and everyone loves it. And then the eighth is kind of short and funny. And people, didn't know what to do with it. And Beethoven always said, well, the eighth is really so much better than the seventh. That's why no one understands it. Well, that's how I feel about the fourth, actually. The eighth, at least, is very much what it is. People may think it's not as great as the works around it, but that's because most people understand it as intentionally not being as great as the works around it. In other words, it's a smaller work, a more compact work. Its aim is different. But the fourth, no. You'd be making a terrible mistake if you think that about the fourth. It's a big symphony. It uses Beethoven's smallest orchestra. It only has one flute, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But it's longer than the fifth in most performances. It's a big work. It has one of those third movement scherzos that goes around twice. It has huge dimensions. The slow movement of the fourth is one of the most extraordinary creations in all of Beethoven. It's a rondo in full classical rondo form. That is A, B, A, C, A, B, A. And when you do that in a slow movement, you're talking big. You're talking ample proportions. But the symphony never seems to be all that big because it's all in scale. Everything relates to everything else so well. And that's really part of the secret of what makes the fourth so special. Now, the Eroica, it is an incredible piece. I mean, I'm not saying it's a bad piece of music, don't get me wrong. I'm just talking about personal preferences. And the Eroica broke new expressive ground, which is why everybody praises it so much because it has a certain obviousness about it, quite frankly. Two big, huge movements. One is long and heroic, and the other is long and tragic. I mean, it's the funeral march. But then it has two kind of throwaway movements at the end. The scherzo and the finale, which is kind of patchy. It's a theme and variation sort of thing with a fugal something mixed in with it. It doesn't mean it's bad. It just means that those movements are totally out of scale to the first two movements. They really are. And, this was obviously Beethoven's intention because he'd already taken his audience on a enormous roller coaster ride of feeling, and he wanted to not make it insanely difficult to the point where, he didn't give a damn if anybody survived to the end. I mean, he was not the Alan Pedersen of the classical period. He was trying at some point to cheer people up and be nice to them and respect their limited attention spans. But this is not about the Eroica. The Fourth Symphony, on the other hand, all of the movements are in proportion. They're all in some kind of reasonable shooting distance of length of each other in some respects. It's just the most amazing piece. And it does break new expressive ground, as I said. But the new expressive ground is in the expression of more cheerful emotions or more ambivalent emotions, twilit emotions, perhaps most obviously in the opening. I mean, that opening fantastic introduction with those two completely strange ideas. Here they are. I want you to hear them. This, as usual for these examples, comes from one of my all-time favorite Beethoven cycles, which has no weak performances. Paul Kletsky with the Czech Philharmonic on Supraphon. Listen to this introduction. There had never been anything in music like it. So it's not a 15-minute funeral march. That doesn't make it any less astonishing for what it is, which is mysterious. The cosmos opens up before us in all of its velvety twilight and mystery. And here it is. Now, whoever did that? That opening, that quiet opening, that's the opening that inspired, for example, Mahler's First Symphony, the opening of Mahler's First Symphony, and quite a few other works as well. But that's one of the most famous ones, the Mahler one. That introduction consists essentially of two ideas, which you just heard. And they announce immediately what's going to make this piece so special. I want you to hear it again. I'm going to play it for you again because I want you to pay attention to the two different ideas. One is legato, that is long notes bound together, and the other is staccato, that is short notes separated by pauses, all in the same slow tempo. So here we are again. Pay attention to these. You see, what Beethoven is going to be doing is in this symphony, he discovers a whole new technique for unifying a symphonic argument. It's a technique that Haydn already knew, but that Beethoven had not exploited up to this point. That's what makes the Fourth compositionally a much more sophisticated piece than the first three symphonies. What you hear is not even so much tunes as texture. Just texture. You have legato versus staccato in even notes, basically. That's what that is. And that introduction is going to shape the entire discourse of the symphony. Believe it or not. It really is. And it's shocking how it happens. It's truly, truly amazing. And I'm going to show you now how that works, just to give you a sample of some of the ways that Beethoven creates this wonderful, wonderfully extravagant and multifarious diversity of happiness out of simple texture, legato versus staccato. So the first theme of the first movement is actually a staccato version, speeded up, of the legato introduction theme, that slow theme, do, 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 that thing, right? Well, here is the first subject played quickly and staccato. Yum bum 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 bum. Right? It's thematically the shape of the melody, not the exact tune. The tune doesn't matter. What matters, we're talking about here, is texture and shape is similar to that first one, and that's all you need. This is the symphony in which Beethoven discovers what Haydn knew, that you don't have to quote things directly. You only have to suggest a similarity. And then families of themes all begin to sound related to each other, and the musical argument snaps into focus with amazing coherence and an organic feel to it, because that staccato bit, that dum, bum, bum, dum, 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 blump, blump, that becomes the cadence theme that concludes the first movement exposition, played legato instead of bum, bum, bum. It's dum, bum, bum, da, do, 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 do. Well, here it is as the cadence theme of the first movement exposition. Now, once you listen to the symphony a little bit and get it under your skin, you begin to hear these things, these resemblances. And the more you listen to it, the more they start to resemble each other. And it's not because everything sounds like everything else. It's because the elements of music that Beethoven is employing to create his thematic material are operating at a very, very fundamental level. We're talking rhythm and texture. And that's basically it. It's just rhythm and texture. And there are some thematic connections as well. For example, that single flute. The single flute. There are many works in the classical period where you have a whole orchestra and one flute. And you say to yourself, gee whiz, I mean, you're scratching yourself on the head. How is someone going to hear the flute? Well, it's not as crazy as you think, because first of all, the flute is operating in a different pitch level usually than most of the other instruments. And second of all, what it means is that even if you don't hear the flute in big loud passages when everyone's playing together and it gets drowned out, whenever it does play, it's going to be solo. It will always be a solo. And so actually, in works that have a single flute, you often hear more flute music than you do in works that have a pair of flutes. And one of the reasons that composers wrote for single flutes rather than pairs is because in those days, particularly, there was no standardized woodwind configuration, excuse me, and particularly when it came to pitch, no two flutes operated at quite the same pitch. So if you tried to allow them to play in unison or even in close harmony, they could sound just dreadful. Getting your flute in tune was a big problem. And so for that reason, composers often just wrote for one of them. Mozart particularly, he detested flutes. I mean, he wrote flute concertos and a concerto for flute and harp because someone told him to. He had to do it. But it was an instrument he despised, probably partly for that reason. But for example, now let's listen to what we have with the flutes. I have prepared a little example. Both the second subject of the first movement and the second subject in the finale feature prominent exposed passages for the flute. And those prominent exposed passages all involve a descending theme. Da 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 ba 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 da 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 do do do, like in the first movement, and then in the finale it's ya da 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 do 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 do, and those also are related to the main theme of the second movement, ya da 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 ba da, and I'm going to play them for you one after the next in that order. It's going to be first movement, fourth movement, second movement. So you can, I think, hear the derivation a little bit more clearly. But you hear the relationship simply because of the timbre of the flute, or woodwinds in this case, or a clarinet with the flute, or whatever it is. And you also hear it because the shape of the melody is quite similar, even though the exact tune is different in each movement. So here are the three, what I call the flute ideas in the Fourth Symphony, even if they're not always played by the flute. Doesn't make any difference. Here you go. I mean, it's really, it's starting to come together, right? You start to hear how the symphony has these organic relationships. And that means that when you hear certain things, like in the finale or whatever, you begin to get a sense that it's all one big happy family, each element with its own special character. And finally, the last and most fascinating aspect, I think, of the symphony, although not our last musical example, mind you, is the way that Beethoven handles what I call musical gesture. This is not necessarily a motive. It's not, a melodic fragment or anything. It's a thing. It's a passage of rhythm and texture, or something. It's a gesture. It's a gesture. It's a gesture. Gesture. And that's what this symphony has. And every single movement has a special gesture, and even these gestures are somewhat related to each other. Now, the gesture in the first movement, it's the first big outburst. It's bia, ba-da-dum. It's that. Beethoven treats it independently. It has its own specific quality, and he uses it loudly, he uses it softly, he develops it extensively. It's its own thing. It's a gesture. In the finale, the gesture is this sort of, the finale is a perpetual motion. And so it's a chugga, 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 and it has this sort of whirling, I don't know what to call it. It's a harmonically rather dense and rhythmically like that. That's what it is. And that in itself is thematically related to the beautiful gesture in the second movement, which is yampa do 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 yampa do 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 yampa do 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 do. I mean, you can hear that they're very, very clearly related to each other. And these are just gestures. You can't define them any other way. They're things that purely music has the ability to do, and that Beethoven uses them to give each movement its own special sort of signal, if you want to call it. But because each movement has them, we know that they're all part of the Fourth Symphony. It's not like the Eroica, where, the scherzo or the finale, you're sort of like, well, what do they have to do with the rest of it? In Beethoven's prior symphonies, the movements are essentially independent. They operate because they're all part of the same work, and the balance and proportions may be very, very elegant in the first or second symphonies, less so in the third. But, the sequence of moods may be entirely appropriate. But in the fourth, the actual fabric of the music means that the entire symphony is an integrated whole. And so here are those three gestures. I just think this is unbelievably cool. I really, really do. The first movement and the second movement and the fourth movement, or maybe not in that order, but I'm going to tell you which ones they are anyway, so you'll know when you hear them, as you hear them go by. Here are the first, second, and fourth gestures in the symphony. So, what about that scherzo? What about the third movement? Well, the third movement is really quite special because the third movement is entirely based on gesture. That opening motive, ba-ba-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-dum, it's not exactly thematic. I mean, it's not a tune that you can sort of hum or whistle very easily, and it's immediately contradicted by what comes after. Do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do. It's nothing but gestures. It's a concatenation of gestures, and that opening gesture, that opening idea, really resembles the ones we've heard before, the second movement and in the fourth movement. Here it is, just so you get a sense of it. I mean, it really is its own sort of extraordinary creation. There's nothing quite like it in earlier music. It's just marvelous. So, here you go. Yeah, it's a gesture. It's a gesture. And one of the interesting things about this symphony, too, is it is also, in my opinion, the first symphony where he really learned how to make his bass lines move and to give them that independence and freedom that creates that feeling of muscular motion. You know, the first three symphonies, wonderful as they are, they can bog down. There are moments where unless the conductor is on top of it, you can have dead spots. This is particularly true of the Eroica. I mean, I don't need to tell you, there are more bad performances out there of the Eroica. It can really die if the conductor isn't keeping it moving. The fourth, on the other hand, although there are, outstanding performances, there are also a lot of really mostly very good ones because the music is written in such a way that it never actually stops moving forward. I mean, a bad performance can kill it, don't get me wrong, but it takes more effort. It has more lives than any previous Beethoven symphonies, and that's because of the bass lines. And one of the places where you hear it, or you should, you don't always, is at the very end of the A section of the scherzo, where it's going da-da-da-da-da-da, boo-doo-doo-doo-doo, da-da-da-da-da-da. You should hear that boom, 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 boom rhythm, top and bottom. Half the time, in so many performances, the bass line is just obliterated by the string tremolo at the top, because they're just holding this note going loud. But what you should hear is underneath. You should hear it, and you do in this performance. Here it is, Beethoven's fabulous bass lines. Here's one of the earliest examples in a symphony of that fantastic technique that would serve him so well from here on in. Yeah, get the bass. And so, for all of these reasons that I've been talking about, the fourth is really the first fully mature Beethoven symphony. Again, it may have a smaller orchestra than the Eroica, but it sounds bigger. It sounds fuller. It sounds more fully participatory, in my view. In my view, that doesn't mean that a great performance of the Eroica can't be a great performance. Of course it is. And of course the music sounds marvelous when it's given a great performance. But it's not the same thing. It's not the same thing as paying attention to how the music is actually written. And so, I hope I have made at least a plausible case for the fourth being just as extraordinary as anything else in Beethoven's output. And with that, let's talk about the recordings. I have 7 here. And as I said, there are a lot of very good performances of the fourth because it's a tough piece to kill. But there are a couple of things that I listen for that matter to me. The first, as I've pointed out, is bass lines. I want to hear bass lines. I want to hear down through the texture because it really does represent a new standard in Beethoven's handling of the orchestra. The other thing is a finale that is not too fast. I mean, it is a perpetual motion thing. And this is where I think so many of the period instrument folks screw it up. Except for maybe Franz Bruggen and some other guys like that. But, the idea is not to play it as fast as you humanly can. You want to be able to hear the motion. It shouldn't be a blur. You have to hear the rhythm. There's rhythm in everything Beethoven did, and especially in the symphony. The rhythms are so important. Think of the second movement, that fabulous rondo. Even though it has, its sections are A, B, A, C, A, B, A, you have this rhythm that goes through the whole thing here and again. It's bum, ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. That's it. That too is a gesture, a rhythmic gesture. And it permeates the whole movement. This symphony is as much an essay in rhythm as the seventh would be an essay in rhythm. And it needs to be treated with just as much care, in my view. There's a wonderful, wonderful rehearsal segment with Bruno Walter doing Beethoven's fourth. And his version is not in here, but it could be because it's a wonderful performance. All he does for most of the rehearsal is rehearse dum, ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum in the second movement to get it played with rhythmic accuracy every time you hear it. It's really very, very interesting to listen to. So those are the criteria I listen for. And, well, here are 7 performances that I think really pay special attention to those things that matter to me. Other things may matter to you more. Of course, Paul Kletsky with the Czech Philharmonic on Supraphon. Fantastic performance, absolutely first rate, as I hope you've heard, with that incomparable Czech Philharmonic woodwind section in a symphony notable for its wonderfully free and kaleidoscopic treatment of the woodwinds, including the wonderful solo flute, which you've heard. Also, absolutely magnificent, Toscanini. Yeah, because in a symphony that depends so heavily on rhythm and muscular energy. I mean, Toscanini is your guy for rhythm and muscular energy. And it's a great, great performance. Tovey said about the fourth exactly what I've been talking about. And I freely admit that he was the guy who first turned me on to the symphony's special qualities. He called it athleticism, the quality of muscular movement. It's not a function of speed. It's a function of movement, the idea of something making progress from one place to another in an inexorable way. And that's the quality the fourth has. It has no dead spots, and Toscanini has no dead spots. Also, bass lines. Bass lines is Klemperer. Klemperer is woodwinds and bass lines. That's what a Klemperer performance does. And Klemperer is wonderful because he shows us, because his tempi are usually so moderate, that excitement, that power is not a function of speed. It really isn't. I mean, there are some pieces that are nothing but that should be as fast as possible, as dazzling as you can possibly make them. But Beethoven's fourth is not one of those pieces. And the finale in particular is not one of those pieces, even though it's a perpetual motion. The key is the motion. You have to feel the motion. And in Klemperer, boy, do you feel the motion. And boy, do you hear those bass lines at the end of the scherzo. Oh, God, it's fabulous. It's another one of those moments where it just sounds like a different piece, the way Klemperer handles it. Not because it's slow, it's just because you hear everything. And when you can hear everything, what a difference it makes. How much more substantial, and how much more you're able to grasp the shades, the nuances of joy, of happiness that Beethoven writes into this splendid symphony. After Klemperer, Blomstedt, because the Staatskapelle Dresden, this is his earlier Staatskapelle Dresden Beethoven cycle, was such a fabulous orchestra. And they are so ideally suited to this music. In a way, they're quite similar to the Czech Philharmonic. They're one of those ensembles where although they have a wonderful corporate sonority when they're all playing together, each section has its individual character. And so the more personality you can give the music, the more character with which you imbue the thematic material, the more color those different gestures have, the more expressive intensity the music acquires. And so this is a wonderful performance. Blomstedt is just great in that symphony. Now, my last three, we're coming to the last three. We're going through these recordings rather quickly because, I think that they're pretty straightforward recommendations, and they don't need a heck of a lot of additional commentary after you've sat through that whole exordium I did at the beginning. This one is one that a lot of people don't think about, but my colleague up in Quebec, Christophe Huss at Le Devoir magazine in Montreal, he said to me, listen to this one, it'll surprise you. And he was right. It's one that people sort of overlook. Joachim with the Berlin Philharmonic. This is Joachim's first Beethoven cycle, and this fourth is really a smoker. It's just unbelievably powerful, but also, Joachim was one of those flexible rhythm guys. He was like Furtwängler, but with more discipline and less heaviness. And you have in this fourth symphony this power and flexibility that goes so perfectly with the music's innate muscularity and drive. And so if you have this cycle, it's in the Joachim box, of course, the big DG box. Listen to this fourth, Joachim with the Berlin Phil. Just give it a special moment of its own, and I guarantee you'll be dazzled. It's a fantastic performance. But all of the great fourths are not old. They're not all old performances. One of the more recent ones that I think is just astonishingly fine, I've got to take its little bookie out here for the glare, was Haitink with the LSO. This recording of Symphonies 4 and 8 is absolutely the highlight of Haitink's last Beethoven cycle. I mean, how many has he done? 3 of them now or so? And all of them had their really tepid and moments and dead spots. That's just a fact. But his latest one with the London Symphony is easily his best. And this performance, 4 and 8, wow, they just nail it. They absolutely nail it. It is audibly influenced by the period instrument movement. The tempos tend to be quicker than Haitink used before. There's more prominence to trumpets and timpani. The colors are less blended and coagulated than we sometimes heard from Haitink and modern instruments more generally, on occasion anyway. Not when great conductors do it, but when they're being slovenly. And boy, oh boy, this is a fantastic performance of the Fourth Symphony. Just a joy to listen to, and very well recorded, actually. Especially, those Barbican things, they can sound sort of dry and terrible, but this is very impactful, and it sounds really good. However, I have to pick one, and this one may surprise you. I think maybe it will. We'll see. Karl Böhm with the Vienna Philharmonic, my fave. In the fourth of all symphonies, Böhm was Beethoven 5 and Beethoven 9 and the Eroica, the hard minor key, grim, dark Germanic. But no, my friends. This fourth first of all, he plays it like the Eroica or the Fifth. In other words, in Böhm's hands, the Fourth doesn't sound in any way small scale or diminutive. Schumann had the incredibly stupid description of the Fourth Symphony as, a slender Norse maiden, between two hefty German Hausfraus or something like that. I don't know. He called it two Greek gods or whatever. It was stupid. The Fourth is not little, and it has more energy, more muscular energy, more kinetic energy than the Eroica does, and really than a lot of the Fifth, aside from the outer movements. It's an extraordinary exercise in coiled rhythmic fury, and Böhm really lets it rip with the Vienna Philharmonic in full cry. And it's another example of how much more appropriate it is to play the music with large modern forces, because there are aspects to the music that no period instrument group, no chamber orchestra, no matter how good they are, no matter how loudly they play, can realize with the same effortless power of a major orchestra. And the Fourth is as much about power as anything else Beethoven wrote. In fact, like I said, it's the symphony where he first learned to truly master the power of the orchestra. And the fact that he did it with the smallest ensemble he ever used in a symphony is one of those miracles of genius that makes Beethoven so special. And the Fourth, such an extraordinary work in his output. So give Böhm and Vienna a try in the Fourth and see if you don't agree. With that, my friends, I urge you to go give the Fourth a shot. Even if you think you know it, just give it a serious, considered, sit down, don't read a book, don't sit on the toilet, don't make a sandwich, just listen. And let the music wash over you. It's really an amazing experience. And if you haven't treated yourself to it in a while, then you really owe it. You really owe yourself the opportunity to come to grips with this most extraordinary and undervalued of all the Beethoven symphonies. So keep on listening, folks. Thank you for joining me. Take care.